It was a trip that Abby had been looking forward to. New York is the city she had always dreamed of going to. But her dreams were almost dissolved in her marriage to Brad and their long days together in Little Illinois. He was a kind, honest, and quiet man. There was no romance, but it didn't matter to Brad, and she couldn't figure out when she had allowed her dreams to become flat, black and white sketches on the ceiling of her mind. She was a talented designer, a good employee, and a valuable employee, but her work remained a hobby in the family. Brad was not interested in her success and seemed to perceive her as a familiar element of his everyday world, with a schedule included shopping trips, cleaning, dinners, evening news, and occasional conversations that often boiled down to discussing repairs or weekend plans. It was an opportunity to get out of that little world where she woke up every morning with the same thoughts, saw the same faces, and felt the same emptiness in those moments when Brad seemed to look through her, even when he was sitting across the kitchen table. Now she had a new project with a European company, and she was excited to pack her suitcase, hoping that in New York she would feel something that would bring her back to life. "Good trip." Brad said goodbye briefly, turning her suitcase away and heading towards the TV as if nothing had changed. Her hand was stuck on the door handle, and she wanted to look around and ask him, "Will you miss me for a while?" But she just squeezed her lips and threw the thought out of her head. "Thank you, Brad," she said, squeezed out, feeling like something invisible was pulling her away from this house, where she had more memories of other people than her own, and the flight from Chicago to New York was going smoothly. She was thinking about the project, imagining how she would present her ideas to French partners, thinking about the concept and the details of the meeting, and Abby was somewhat confident, but she was still nervous about working side by side with a famous French designer. Apparently, his name was quite loud in European circles, and she unwittingly represented someone who was difficult to please and impossible to negotiate with. When the plane landed, Abby felt a pleasant excitement, as if she were on the threshold of a new chapter in her life. New York met her with the cold air and the buzzing noise of the city that never seemed to stop. When she got in the taxi, Abby couldn't help but press her face against the glass, looking at the skyscrapers and the neon signs and the lights that lit up around her, and the city was literally in a whirlwind, and she caught herself thinking that she was breathing her full chest. From the 12th floor, the view was spectacular, and she looked down at the street for a long time, at the flickering lights of the cars, feeling her heart beating faster. That first night, she barely slept. Her thoughts were full of anticipation. In the morning, Abby arrived at the office where she was supposed to start work on a project a little earlier than required. She walked into the glass doors of the huge building, and a secretary came out to meet her to lead her into the conference room. Taking a deep breath, Abby mentally prepared herself for a formal conversation, imagining a cold and purely professional atmosphere. Tall, thin, with thick black hair carefully combed back, with a light brush shadow and lively dark eyes, he was the epitome of refinement and style. His gaze was a chain, and Abby realized that he was looking at her with interest, lifting the corners of his lips slightly in a light, friendly smile. His handshake was a breath of fresh confidence, and it struck her. He was not at all what she expected to see in a European designer. He seemed to be completely immersed in the moment, as if he really wanted to meet her, not just formally introduce herself. "Is this your first time in New York?" "I've never been to this town before." "In that case, I'm happy to be your guide, and I hope you'll trust me on this journey." He nodded a little bit and finally let go of her hand, and she caught herself standing still, fascinated by his gaze and the way his words left a slight imprint on her mind. She was dizzy from the thought that someone might be looking at her so closely, someone who might actually see her, rather than just seeing her as a background detail, as Brad did, and Abby caught a glimpse of something inside her that had been hidden for a long time. But she just smiled, trying not to notice it, because it was just work, she reminded herself. But somewhere deep inside, she felt that something had changed, and in the conference room, Abby took her place opposite Oliver, and their project was to create a new furniture collection for a French hotel chain, with an emphasis on combining minimalism and elegance, emphasizing French charm and comfort. At first, the meeting went as she expected. The concept discussion, the division of responsibilities, the professional views on the design details. But the longer they talked, the more she caught his gaze. He was easy to talk about design, but his energy seemed to be always directed at her. He had a way of listening to her ideas, as if there was something in those words that Abby hadn't even guessed about, and he seemed to pick up her thoughts without the slightest strain and develop them into his own concept. Working with him was as easy as working with an old friend, and Abby felt her confidence growing, her own ideas coming alive under his watchful eye. After a long discussion, Oliver offered a short break and invited her to take a walk in the neighboring park. They left the building, and Oliver held the door, gallantly letting it through, and then politely pointed the way. New York is full of surprises, he said, smiling. It was a pity to have him in the stuffy conference room. The park was small but lively, with green trees, blooming clubs, and wide lanes. Abby felt the fresh air, the warm sun, and the sight of Oliver nearby made her a little tense, but that tension didn't scare her. It made her heart beat a little faster. Oliver looked at her as if he really wanted to hear her answer. "It's amazing, but I really feel alive here," she said honestly, a little embarrassed by her own confession. "It's because you really live here," he said, without taking his eyes off her. "I think there are places in the world where you start to hear yourself better." Abby paused for a second, realizing that he was guessing her thoughts. She never thought that a conversation with someone she hardly knew could seem so deep and sincere that you could find meaning and answers to your own questions. "Why do you think people stay where they no longer feel happy?" Oliver raised his eyebrow a little, but he didn't seem surprised. He looked at her closely, and she felt him picking out an answer, as if she knew that what she was saying was more than just a mere curiosity. And sometimes they're afraid of finding it and losing everything they've built, and the words she's been reciting. And she's caught something in them that's close, something that made her think about her own desires. Or was she afraid that if she allowed herself to feel true happiness, she would have to see the truth? Her thoughts were interrupted by Oliver, who suggested that they continue the walk. They passed a small coffee shop, and he, slightly nodding towards the establishment, made the invitation gesture. "I promise it will be French," he added with a smile. Abby laughed, and then went into a cozy cafe, lit with soft light. There were few visitors, and they easily found a table by the window. She took the cup and looked at it carefully. "Tell me," Abby called her by name for the first time, which caused her to feel a slight tingle in her chest. "Did it ever occur to you that one trip could change everything?" She froze, confused by his question, but recalling her thoughts, she smiled restrainedly. "Honestly, I thought I was mature enough for such a change," she replied, trying to keep a distance. But Oliver was adamant and seemed to see through her. Sometimes change comes to those who don't expect it at all, and that's their strength. He leaned back on the back of his chair, keeping his gaze focused on her. His words pierced her again. They sounded like an invitation to something more than just a business meeting, but Abby couldn't quite figure out what it was. After the coffee, they went back to the office, continuing their work, but now every look and gesture of Oliver seemed more meaningful to her. She felt her thoughts like a magnet drawn to his words, her mind shifting slowly towards something new, disturbing, but compelling. And the next day, while working with him on the presentation, Abby tried to stay away, to be extremely professional, but she was having trouble. Oliver continued to break through her inner barriers with seemingly unconscious ease, and with every move, every look, she felt her own desire to break out of the familiar world grow stronger. She was troubled by the magnetic power of his words, his gaze, his ability to seem to sense her thoughts. The evening after Oliver had successfully prepared for the next phase of the project, he invited Abby to dinner. She hesitated. They chose a small restaurant with a cozy dimmed light and a warm atmosphere, as if it were specially designed for revelation, and behind their table were small candles, creating a darkness that separated their conversation from the rest of the world. The dinner was unexpectedly light and revealing. In a conversation, she learned that Oliver was not at all what she had imagined him to be. At first, they talked about work, discussing ideas and direction for the project, but over time the conversation itself took on a more personal side. Abby learned that Oliver had spent most of his life in Paris, in a family that had been designing interiors for several generations, and his mother was an artist and his father was an architect, and he said that there was a world of color and form in the house, and in that atmosphere, every child was simply obliged to become a creative person. His voice sounded soft with a subtle French accent, and she listened to him with the feeling that she was immersed in a strange but seductive life, completely unlike her own. "How did you become a designer?" she asked, barely restraining her curiosity. Oliver leaned forward. His gaze became serious for a moment. "It must have been inevitable," he replied, smiling. "But I've always wanted to be a pilot. Except I guess my dad was right when he said that I'm more interested in what we build on the ground than in the sky, and I like to see people change when they're surrounded by something beautiful." She wanted to answer honestly, but something inside her was fighting that desire. "I guess I've always wanted to create beauty. Maybe it sounds too simple, but I like to get people comfort, a sense of comfort." She froze, looking away. "Sometimes I think it's also a way of finding peace." Oliver looked at her carefully, and in his eyes she felt understanding. He didn't rush her. He didn't try to get her into the usual dialogue. He was really interested in what she was saying, and it embarrassed her. "Peace," he repeated quietly. "It's a rare thing that few people find, especially in a relationship." Abby got a little tense. She caught the hint, but she kept looking at him, and she realized that each new question was taking them further away from the topic of the work, that this conversation was going beyond the usual, but she was too comfortable with his attention. Sometimes stability can be a heavy burden, Oliver thought, and there was something deep in his eyes that she couldn't fully understand. He spoke slowly, like he was weighing every word. Her heart beat faster, and a wave of anxiety rose within her, terrified at how well he seemed to understand her thoughts, as if he knew her doubts and her hidden desires. And the waitress brought her dessert, and Oliver offered her a French snack with a smile. Abby gave up, feeling the barriers between them weaken, and with each conversation her inner world opened up for him. "I wasn't going to ask personal questions," he said, looking away and carefully turning the wine glass in his hands, "but I think they found their way. Sorry if this looks like an intrusion." His words sounded genuine, and she found it strange and pleasant to hear such attention from a man she had known for only 2 days. For a moment she wanted to tell him everything about her life with Brad, about how her soul was almost extinguished in this marriage, about her fear of change. "Sometimes it is in other people's questions that you can find your own answers," she said, feeling her voice slightly trembling. Oliver looked at her carefully, not hurrying, allowing her to speak exactly as much as she wanted. Their eyes met, and in that moment Abby felt that the line between them, between the forbidden and the permissible, had almost disappeared. The world seemed to have been swept away in their little corner of New York City, leaving only him and her, separated by an unknown force, attractive and frightening at the same time. Oliver raised his hand to her, gently touching her fingers. It was barely noticeable, but it was like an electrical discharge went through her skin. She wanted to take her hand away, but she didn't, allowing herself to forget all the obligations and rules for a moment. "Let me show you New York as I see it," he said quietly, as if he was afraid to break the magic of the moment. Her voice softened, and she barely whispered, "Yes, please." They left the restaurant and went for a walk in New York City at night. Oliver took her through the streets he knew as his own, stopping to show her small cafes, antique shops, where he said they smelled of history. They passed through several busy neighborhoods, and Oliver said that he used to come to New York often, calling it art written in concrete, and Abby listened to him, feeling like she was part of some strange, but surprisingly pleasant dream. They came to a jazz club hidden between tall buildings, and Oliver offered to come in, smiling, and they were surrounded by live music, warm lights, and moody conversations. And there was a soft saxophone playing on stage, and Oliver took her hand and invited her to dance, and they didn't say a word, they just moved to the beat of the slow music, and it was like time had stopped. She could feel his breath, his hand on her waist, his gaze filled with something she couldn't quite name, her heart beating fast. And in that moment, Abby suddenly realized that maybe for the first time in years, she felt alive. Those few minutes flew by like a dream, and when the tune was over, they were still standing, looking at each other as if there was no one around. Oliver gently put his hand over her cheek and said softly, "I don't want this night to end." Her thoughts were confused. She knew that this moment violated all her established principles, that she was taking a risk by going this far, but she didn't want to stop. She was suddenly terrified that she would wake up the next morning and go back to her normal life, where nothing like this would ever happen. "Me too," she replied, barely hearing her, her eyes closed. They left the club and, without saying a word, headed to her hotel. Oliver turned out to be a man whose story was full of unexpected twists and contradictions. He talked about his life in Paris, where he spent his childhood and youth, about his parents, both artists and architects, who taught him to see the world in a special way, to look for beauty in the simplest things. He told of his travels through Europe in search of inspiration, of his falling in love with old buildings, narrow streets, and even the strangers he met along the way, and Abby listened to him, fascinated by his sincerity, even with some surprise, in telling her that the world was an infinite kaleidoscope. She knew that Oliver saw things more deeply than most people, that he valued every moment and lived in that moment. And it seemed so far from her own life, where everything seemed to be predictable and verified until the last minute. "Sometimes I think I've almost lost it. I notice that inspiration comes when you let yourself be free," he said, looking at her carefully, and his words sounded not like advice, but like a reminder. "But sometimes you have to step into the unknown. You've always been so free?" she asked, trying to steer the conversation into a less personal direction. Oliver smiled and leaned back a little, as if thinking, "Maybe not always. But one day I realized that living within limits and predictability is a lot to lose. And since then, I've been trying to take advantage of the opportunities that life can give me." And Abby thought about how many opportunities, how many moments she could have, but she was deliberately turning them down, preferring a quiet, normal life. And she realized that her life had turned gray, not by itself, but because she had allowed it to. It seemed like every word, every look was building an invisible connection that they both felt, but they didn't want to admit it yet, and yet there was no longer any boundary between them. When Oliver offered to take her for a walk in the night city, Abby agreed. New York in the light of the lights was like a fairy tale, and she kept feeling that this moment was something special. They walked along, sometimes almost touching each other's shoulders, and they were silent, feeling that words were not needed. They passed a small jazz club with warm, live music, and Oliver stopped, smiled, and looked at her and offered to come in. "Why not? I'm going to be a great dancer," she said, feeling she couldn't resist his offer, or the exciting freedom he gave her. The club was dark and cozy. The band was playing soft jazz on stage, and the music filled the space, immersing them in a special atmosphere. Oliver, without thinking, invited her to dance. Abby was lost for a moment, but the next second she was in his hands, moving to the slow rhythm of the saxophone. It wasn't just a dance. It was a touch which was everything they wanted but couldn't say. Oliver held her by the waist, and Abby felt the warmth coming from his hand all over her body. She closed her eyes, giving herself to the music, to the moment, to his touch. Her heart was pounding, and for the first time in a long time, she felt alive. "You know," he whispered, almost touching her ear with his lips, "this is the best night I've had in a long time. Her breath caught, and she said quietly, without opening her eyes, I feel it too. They stood still, swinging in the rhythm of the music until the melody was over. The world around them stopped, and in that moment, it seemed as if they were both on the verge of something new, dangerous, and unknown. And when the music stopped, Oliver took her hand and gently, as if afraid to take the moment, held her hand, a gesture that seemed both simple and full of hidden meaning. Abby looked at him, and in his eyes saw the same desire that had long been hidden within her. It was quiet on the street. The city was sleeping at night. The lights of the skyscrapers flashed somewhere in the distance. They said nothing, but they both knew that there were no longer any boundaries between them. Oliver bent his head a little, without taking his eyes off her. He slowly put his hand over her cheek and, bending, barely touched her lips noticeably. The kiss was as light as the breeze, but it broke the barrier that had kept them both from hiding. And when he offered to walk her to the hotel, Abby didn't mind, returning to the hotel in a state of near euphoria. New York at night, the light of the streetlights, the warm evening, and Oliver by her side, all mixed in her memory, leaving a sense of unreality and a slight anxiety. The events of the last few days were so different from her usual life that Abby seemed to be not quite herself. She didn't know what to expect from tomorrow, from the next time she saw Oliver, from herself, and when she opened the door and turned off the light, she realized that in the darkness, her voice was still playing against the background of a jazz melody, and her memory was still traced by his touch. She was lying on her bed, looking up at the ceiling, and she was thinking about the events of the evening. And she was thinking about Brad, calm, confident, and completely detached, and she was trying to justify herself, because they had been separated for a long time, and their marriage was more like a union of convenience than a relationship. But no matter what she told herself, the anxious guilt didn't go away. The next day, in the office, Abby tried to focus on the project, but her thoughts kept coming back to the night before. She couldn't shake the feeling that that night changed everything. Every time the door to the conference room opened, she would shudder, hoping to see him, but every time there were other people standing on the doorstep. Finally, just as she was beginning to think that he might just disappear from her life, like a dream, the door opened and Oliver came into the room. He was collected and polite, but there was something warm in his gaze, barely noticeable when their eyes met. For a fraction of a second, she thought he remembered their dancing, their conversation, but it was too fleeting. They started discussing the details of the project, and Abby noticed how easy he was to behave, as if nothing was between them except work. He calmly asked questions, listened to her suggestions on business matters with professional ease. It was both calming and frustrating. She wanted to know how he felt, but he was so insensitive, as if he didn't want to talk about it. And after another meeting, when everyone had already left, he stopped at the exit and, as if not to mention it, said quietly, "You look beautiful today, Abby." There was no hint of flirting in his voice, but there was something about the way he said her name that touched her deeply, and she had a slight smile on her face. But before she could answer, he had already turned and walked out, and Abby was still feeling her excitement. His innocent compliments, his gaze, which lasted only a moment, were so powerful that it made her heart beat. It was all strange and new to her. She tried to understand what was happening, but her inner world was too turbulent, and the boundaries of her usual life were crumbling one by one. Abby tried to resist, trying to convince herself that nothing could happen between them, that she needed to stop seeing them before she got too far, but something inside her no longer belonged to her. It was as if someone invisible was pushing her forward, toward him, toward this feeling that seemed to light her up from within, and they chose another restaurant, a quiet place with a panoramic view of the evening city, and Abby tried to be restrained, to keep the conversation formal, but it was as impossible as stopping the water pouring from an open tap. The longer they talked, the more unspoken words they had, the more tension they had, and as they talked, Oliver held her hand, and Abby was as if under hypnosis, and they were sitting there, holding hands, and there was no need for words between them, and she knew that this moment had changed her forever. And though she was afraid to admit it to herself, she knew she wanted to stay with him, at least for the night, just for a moment, to forget what was waiting for her at home, and that one day it would all be over. And when they went outside, Oliver stopped, looked at her, and said quietly, "I'm not asking you for anything. I just want you to know that I'm really happy with you." She was overwhelmed with emotion, mingled with a strong feeling that she couldn't name, and they were standing next to him, and he touched her again, but this time she couldn't help it, and her own desires burst out, and she realized that she didn't want to think about anything anymore, and her heart beat faster as he leaned over, and his kiss was like a flash of light in the darkness. She forgot about everything, feeling only his touch and the heat of her own feelings. Abby did not remember how they got to her room. It was like a fog, and when she closed the door behind them, all the remnants of doubt disappeared. That night, she allowed herself to feel alive, allowed her feelings to take over her reason, and the morning in New York met with a sharp sense of unreality, as she lay in silence listening to the distant noise of the streets outside her window, and every moment she spent with Oliver flashed before her eyes, filling her with joy and trepidation at the same time. This feeling, a mixture of happiness, shame, and fear, almost completely took over her, making her heart beat harder. As soon as the sun came up, Oliver, without saying a word, kissed her goodbye and left, leaving in the room a faint smell of his cologne. He made no promises, spoke no more about the future, and this only added to her confusion. She knew deep down that his silence, his reluctance to talk about what was going to happen next, was a form of worry for him, a desire to preserve that moment without destroying it with a load of promises. But she wanted more, much more. But every look at Oliver, every brief meeting in the office, was thrown back into those nighttime moments when everything seemed to make sense, and he was restrained and even aloof, not saying anything that would betray their connection. But the tension between them grew, and it grew with each passing day. They were exchanging short glances, barely touching, but Abby felt that the story wasn't over. A few days later, after long meetings and discussions, she received a message from Oliver, just a few words, but they immediately made her blood boil. "Another dance tonight?" It wasn't a request or a challenge. It was a reminder of what she might lose if she tried to get back into the routine, shut herself off and hide from what had shattered her life. Abby knew that agreeing to meet him was dangerous, that it could destroy everything she had built. But after taking a breath, she still said, yes. He was as elegant as ever, and when he saw her, his face lit up with a warm, restrained smile. They didn't discuss where they were going. It didn't matter to them anymore. Oliver led her through small streets filled with lights and the sounds of the city until they came to a small restaurant overlooking the waterfront. "And today it's all yours." Abby felt her heart beat faster. There was more to his words than just kindness. They sounded like a confession, an attempt to reveal his feelings that he'd been hiding for so long. They were silent, enjoying the moment until the waiter came along. Oliver ordered wine, and they spent several hours together. And after dinner, Oliver took her hand again, and they went down the street where the warm wind blew, and they were silent, but there was more in that silence than any words they could say. He took her to a small jazz club, similar to the one they had spent their first night together, and looked her in the eye and asked her to dance again. And Abby walked slowly toward him, letting herself be trusted. It was more than just a dance. It was a moment that would stay with her forever. Her anxiety, her fears, all of that disappeared when he hugged her and held her tight, protecting her from anything that could ruin that moment. And they moved to the soft music, and it felt like the world around her had stopped. Oliver pulled her closer, their eyes met, and for a moment she realized that there was nothing between them but their own feelings, which could no longer be denied. "You know," he said quietly, barely noticeably smiling. Meeting you changed me. You made me remember what it was to feel alive. Abby couldn't answer. There was a lump stuck in her throat, and all she could do was look at it, feeling how every word he said filled a void in her that she hadn't been able to explain to herself for so long. She finally let herself out of the familiar world and saw that life is not just about obligations and routines. When the dance was over, Oliver barely noticed him and whispered in her ear, "Come to me." She didn't answer, just nodded, feeling that her own desires had finally overcome all the barriers she had been putting up for herself for so many years. They talked about everything, about Paris, about life, about the dreams they both dreaded, and spent the rest of the night in his room, with the city lights illuminating the room and the noise of New York City at night as their backdrop. It was a moment when she felt closer to someone than she had ever felt, and with every touch of it she felt liberated from everything that had held her back in her previous life for so long. But by the morning she realized that their story could not continue. As she said goodbye to him on the doorstep of his room, her heart was pounding with pain, but she knew it was inevitable. They didn't make any promises, they didn't talk about the future. Their farewell kiss was a warm but bitter reminder that their story would only be a moment, a flash of light in her life. She knew that this moment would stay with her forever, like something forbidden but real, like her little secret that she would keep for years to come. Returning home was a test for Abby. As soon as she got off the plane and saw the familiar views of a small town, she was overwhelmed by a wave of reality from which she could not hide. She spent a few days in New York, but it seemed like she'd lived there all her life. And now she couldn't get Oliver out of her head, his voice, his touches, his promise to let her feel alive. For a moment, Abby caught herself wanting to tell him all about New York, about the nights that woke up something real in her. But instead she just smiled, feeling like a traitor, and answered his questions without going into details. And every day with Brad seemed so heavy and almost unbearable. She was trying to get back to her normal rhythm. Work, dinner, the occasional chat at the kitchen table. But deep down she knew it was impossible, and her thoughts kept coming back to Oliver, to the night streets of New York, to the silence in his room, where they shared more than just words, and she caught herself looking at her phone, waiting for messages that didn't come. The voice inside her kept whispering that her life would never be the same, that she would never be able to pretend that nothing had happened, that weeks had passed, but the feeling of emptiness inside her had not gone away, and that every day she felt more and more that her old life no longer satisfied her. She tried to get out of her cage, go into galleries, going to cafes, going out to the city, hoping to find herself in the little things. But none of these things brought her the genuine joy of New York, and she tried to talk to Brad, implying that their marriage had become more like a friendship. But he was adamant, as always, "We're fine. We're stable. And that's the most important thing, isn't it?" His words were like a wall that she couldn't break through, and she wanted to scream, wanted him to see her suffering. But he was too caught up in his routine, his habits, and one night, unable to stand the loneliness, Abby decided to go. She took out her phone, found Oliver's number, and with her hands trembling, she wrote him a short message. "I can't pretend anymore. I can't forget about us." She didn't know what to expect. He might not even answer. At some point, she was embarrassed by the impulsive message, and she wanted to delete it, but the phone rang. It was Oliver. "Abby," he said, and she felt a warmth in his voice. She froze for a moment, but then she answered, and the conversation went on as usual. They spoke as if it had been only a few hours, not weeks, as if nothing had changed. Oliver said he still works in New York, that he remembers her every night, and although he didn't say it directly, Abby felt that he also meant something to their relationship. She asked, feeling her voice trembling a little. He was silent for a second, and in that pause she heard something more than just an answer. "I was afraid to ruin what you have," he replied softly. "I thought it might be better for you." She understood that it was a gesture of care, that he was trying to protect her without intruding into her life. But now it was clear to her that this protection could not bring her happiness. She could not return to a life where he was not. She could not be who she was before New York. "I want to come back to you." Those words seemed decisive to her, as if she had said them for the first time to herself, as if she had finally understood what she really wanted. Oliver didn't say a word, but she felt that he understood her without words. After that conversation, Abby made the decision that she had been working towards for weeks. She didn't know what was ahead of her, and she was afraid of judgment, of possible loss, but she finally felt confident that she was on her way. When she got her spirit back and told Brad that she couldn't go on living the way she did, he was shocked. For the first time in years, she saw something on his face that looked like strong emotions, maybe even pain. "Abby, why?" "We were happy. We had everything we needed." He tried to object, clearly not understanding her pain and despair. "All we have is a habit." After a long, painful conversation, Brad agreed. He was having a hard time, and she knew it hit him harder than he could show, but Abby realized there was no other way. She couldn't stay in a life where she didn't feel alive. The city greeted her with noise and light, which seemed to revive her from within, and Oliver waited for her in the very place where they had first met, in the center of the office where their project had begun. He smiled when he saw her, and she saw in his eyes the same tenderness that she had seen when they first met. "You're back," he said softly, looking at her with the same sincerity that he had looked at her that first night together. "I'm back," she replied, realizing that everything was finally in place. They rented a comfortable apartment in an old Manhattan building with high windows that gave a view of the city, and at first it seemed like every day was a breath of fresh air, an exciting time, full of new discoveries and changes, and her life was finally filled with what she had been looking for so long: spontaneity, emotion, and a sense of being alive. But as the first romantic enthusiasm subsided, the inevitable questions began to arise. Oliver was a man of peace. His life was about traveling, projects, and frequent change of scenery. Abby realized this soon after their reunion. His work required constant business trips, and every time he left for a week, and sometimes a month, she was left alone. Gradually, the feeling of freedom was mixed with anxiety, fear that her new life was as fragile as their fleeting relationship in New York. One evening, when he returned from a trip to Paris, they were sitting in the kitchen enjoying a glass of wine. Oliver seemed happy and inspired, and he was talking about his new project, sharing his plans, and Abby was looking at him, trying to suppress the confusion that was growing in her, and she realized that she couldn't keep quiet anymore. It seemed like he never really thought about their future, never wondered what would happen when their passion would meet reality. Of course, he looked at her, leaning closer. "You know I'd do anything for you. I know you love your work, travel," she said, "but I need to know if there's more to you and me than just this moment. I don't want to feel like my life is melting into waiting and emptiness again." Oliver listened to her carefully, and in his eyes she saw understanding, but also something else. "Mabiririt. I always thought that our happiness was in freedom, in not being bound by obligations." Those words made her heart ache. She was hurt to hear it, but at the same time, she realized that he was telling the truth. He was always this moment-to-moment person, sincere and devoted, but not one who was able to stay put. It was his freedom that attracted her to him, and perhaps what doomed them to inevitable disappointment. There was a silence in the room in which they both realized that their relationship was on the verge. Oliver couldn't offer her what she wanted, and Abby couldn't live in constant fear of losing something that was so important to her. "Maybe," she said quietly, "I just wanted to be a part of your life, but I can't. I need more than memories and rare moments. I need a future." They both realized that their paths were going in different directions, that despite the strength of their feelings, they could not be together. Abby packed her things and returned to her hometown, but not the same as before. She began to build her life anew. She got a new job, focused on her projects and interests that had previously remained beyond the boundaries of her old world. These changes made her feel meaningful and empowered, and she knew that their connection with Oliver would always be a part of her, that those moments would always be in her heart, that their story was not a mistake, that it was her freedom, her chance to finally find herself and her path. It was a short message with simple words. Thank you for everything. You will always be a part of my life. Oh, she smiled, realizing that despite the distance and time, they both found what they were looking for. Their relationship remained in the past, but it helped her discover her true self and realize that true love begins with love of self.